Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. The natives who had assembled to oppose the landing of our soldiers and were standing either on dry land or else a short distance out into the sea fought with all their limbs unencumbered and on familiar ground, boldly hurling javelins and galloping their horses who were trained to do this kind of work. These perils frightened our soldiers, who were quite unaccustomed to battles of this kind, with the result that they did not show the same alacrity and enthusiasm as they usually did in battles on dry land. But as the Romans still hesitated, chiefly on account of the depth of the water, the man who carried the eagle of the 10th Legion, after praying to his gods that his actions might bring him good luck and luck to the legion, cried in a loud voice, "Jump down, comrades! Unless you want to surrender our eagle to the enemy, I at any rate intend to do my duty to my country and to my general." With those words, he leapt out of the ship and advanced towards the enemy with the eagle in his hands. At this, the soldiers, exhorting one another not to submit to such a disgrace, jumped with one accord from the ship, and the men from the next ships, when they saw them, followed them and advanced against the enemy. So that was Julius Caesar's account of the Gallic War, as read some years later by General Maximus. So this is the moment in 55 BC when the Romans land on British soil for the first time. I think about the Romans daily because they built the framework of the world that we still inhabit. Our laws, our cities, roads, states, and ideas of power, while also leaving behind a brutally honest case study of how societies rise, govern, and of course decay, and then fall. You know, Rome feels uncannily modern because its people argued about corruption, citizenship, populism, inequality, and imperial overreach in ways that very much mirror our own anxieties. And its story endures because it actually gives us language for both ambition and collapse, reminding us, I suppose, that civilization is not a straight line of progress, but a very fragile human achievement that must be constantly defended, renewed, or it quietly unravels. So the exciting thing for me about this, I can remember when I was 13 doing a big kind of timeline of British history, and this was the very first date. And of course, it's the first date in British history, obviously. And so there's a famous joke about 1066 and all that was written in 1930 that actually makes a joke about the state of historical knowledge in Britain. And 1066 is one date, but the only other date in the entire book is 55 BC, which is the year Julius Caesar, the memorable Roman emperor, landed like all other successful invaders on these islands at Thanet. This was in the golden days when the Romans were a top nation on account of their classical education, etc. And obviously that's a joke that depends on people reading this being able to think that Britain is still a top nation due to its classical education. It highlights the way in which maybe in 1930 attitudes to empire and the pacification of natives were slightly different, because it goes on to make the joke that the Roman conquest was a good thing since the Britons were only natives at that time. So that question of whether the Roman conquest was a good thing or a bad thing, I mean, when I was growing up as a child, and I'm sure you all read the Ladybird book about Julius Caesar in the conquest of Britain, and I think it was generally held to be a good thing. It kind of introduced us to hot baths, to wine, to straight roads, all that kind of thing. And of course, Britain's people no longer being painted blue. And I think hair is also an important element of this. And I'll be coming to that a little bit later. I think the sense in which the haircut arrived in 55 BC And subsequently, when Claudius came in the second invasion in 54, I think that's the element to it. But also, of course, the wider point is the story is always told from the perspective of the Romans. So the people traveling, the people who land. But also the ancient Britons were not really seen by imperial British writers as readers in the 19th and 20th century as the desired ancestor. And the desired ancestor, I have to say, to some degree, would have been the Anglo-Saxons, and the heritage is that of Rome. So Britons identify more with Romans in that story, don't they? As readers, we're expected to identify with the Romans. I also think educated people in the era when the British Empire existed were much more inclined to side with the Romans. But I think there was a trend to identify with the Britons just a little bit as well. So if you think of the statue of Boudica, or Boadicea, as she was then called, that stands outside the Houses of Parliament, and I will be coming to Boudica probably in episode 2, I mean, she's the British heroine, despite the fact that she's actually burned down London. So I think there's always been an ambivalence, and I think that ambivalence becomes stronger over recent decades for very obvious reasons. Much greater skepticism about the empire and a kind of awareness of the costs of empire. But I think that's actually a completely non-debate because, of course, both sides are unfathomably alien, unfathomably distant from us. But I'm also aware for everyone listening, and you have to bear this in mind, is firstly that the evidence that we have for this entire story is very patchy. And the consequence of that is that there is too much about both sides that we can't know. But I do think that I'm right in saying that it's easier for us, I think, to identify with the Romans simply because the written sources that we have for this story come from them. They come almost directly from Caesar himself. And I think also people identify with Romans from actually quite a young age, don't they? You often do the Romans at school when you're what, 5, 6, 7? And we know a lot about the lives of the Romans. We know a lot about the life of Julius Caesar. So that allows us to make educated guesses about his inner life, about his psychology, about what kind of man he was. And we can't do anything like that with any single person, really, who lived on the island of Britain at this point in history. All we know is the name. And so I think that because our written sources come from the Romans, and before them the Greeks as well, there's a sense in which we're looking at this story. We have a sense of Britain slowly coming into focus that is one that derives from Greek and Roman sources. So if you go right back to the beginning, to the earliest written texts, possibly alluding to Britain, they're Greek, not Roman. So you have Herodotus, the first great historian. He doubts Britain even exists. He says, there are said to be islands out there, but I actually don't believe it. And he has a contemporary, a geographer called Hectaceus, and he mentioned there being an island beyond Gaul that he called Hyperborea. And he says that that is sacred to Apollo, the god of the sun, and that it boasts a large temple that is spherical in shape. And so people have thought that that might be a reference to Stonehenge. I doubt it, but I actually like the idea for obvious reasons. And then after them, we do start to get slightly more secure references to Britain. And this is actually due to a Greek who sails from Massilia, which is the Greek foundation that today is Marseille. And he sailed to Britain and to a mysterious island called Ultima Thule. And it's actually unclear exactly where it is, but probably I think it's Iceland, because he describes it as being 6 days' voyage beyond Britain, and it's close to where the sea becomes impenetrable because it's kind of becoming solid, which must be a reference to, the ice packs starting to form. So I think Iceland. And it has to be said, he is much quoted, but also much despised. Lots of the claims that he's making are rather outlandish, and people start to discount them. But I think that we can see that he did go there from what he says. So in his book, which hasn't survived, but is still quoted a lot to this day, he actually refers to Britain, to Ireland, to all other various islands in the archipelago as being a single island. the Nessos Cretenarchi, which translates as the British Island. So the idea of them being British Isles doesn't originate with the British Empire. That's the foundational description. So it's P, not B. So it's the Pertani rather than the Brittany. And in Welsh, Britain, I think, is actually still called to this day Frydan. So there's a kind of trace element to that. The name probably means the painted ones. So in Latin, it's Picti, or the Picts, referring to the natives' fondness for painting themselves blue and for their tattoos. And Pythias also seems to have given individual names to the two largest islands. So Albion is what he calls Britain, and Urnai is Ireland. And he also refers to two promontories in the south. So the westernmost promontory, which is today called Cornwall, is called Valerian, which is so very Tolkien. And the eastern one is called Cantillon, and so that's Kent. And Kent and Thames, the river, are the two oldest attested place names in Britain. And Pythias actually mentions both of them. And so this is in 320 BC? So a long, long time ago. But because so many of the scholars and geographers and historians who follow Pythias, although they use him, they dismiss him as a fabulous kind of fantasist. There is this sense that continues right the way up into the lifetime of Julius Caesar in the 1st century BC, that Britain is a land of mystery and magic, and that people really don't know anything about it. And I think that for Caesar, that's precisely the appeal. That's precisely why he wants to go there, because it's a place of such fantasy and mystery that to be the Roman who lands there first is an absolute kind of massive, great tick against his name. So let's just put Caesar into some context. I've talked about him in previous episodes of Rearview Mirror Chronicles. I've written about him a lot. He's incredibly charismatic. He's charming. He's also incredibly ambitious, from a very well-heeled family, but a family that hasn't really measured up to the standards of its ancestry. So Caesar undoubtedly feels that as a burden. And keep in mind also, he's surrounded by other big beasts in the Roman political sense, Pompey or Crassus, who have done amazing things. And Caesar wants a bit of it. And I think that's, in terms of understanding, a little bit about why he wants to go to Britain. There's also a story from Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, Suetonius as we know him really, as his biographer. And he reports this about 180 years after Caesar has died. But I think there's a large element of truth to it. Caesar's a magistrate at this stage, serving in Spain, and he goes to Gades, which is modern-day Cadiz. And in the temple there, he sees a statue of Alexander the Great. And when he sees it, Suetonius says, he groans as though in disgust at his own lack of accomplishment, because at an age when Alexander had already conquered the world, Caesar himself had actually achieved nothing memorable. And then, the following night, he's supposed to have had a terrible dream in which he forces himself on his mother, which is a horribly unsettling dream. I mean, Dr. Freud would have been all over that. But then it's explained to him, quotes Suetonius. His mother, whom he had seen powerless to push him aside as he raped her, was none other than the earth held to be the parent of all, and that his dream was therefore the prophecy that he would rule the world. And so there is this idea, I think, that by reaching out to seize control of distant lands, so first of all, Gaul, Caesar conquers it and enslaves 1 million people, kills over 1 million people. It was an incredibly bloody conquest. And he's kind of looking ahead to other places. So I think the ocean is on his mind because one of the peoples in Gaul that he subdues as a people in Brittany are called the Venetians. I know it's a little bit confusing, but that's what they're called. And they're a naval power, and they impose tolls on merchants who want to cross the channel and to trade with Britain. And Caesar then commissions a fleet, which he entrusts to Decimus Brutus, one of his lieutenants who will later end up killing him. And Decimus Brutus defeats the Venetian fleet. And meanwhile, Caesar has gone along the rocky coastline of Brittany, subduing the Venetians there as well. And he describes the Venetians in Brittany as being surrounded by the great unbound ocean. And now that Caesar has this fleet, which is used to defeat them, he must be thinking, I can use this. And we know that by 55 BC, he's basically pacified all of Gaul, and he's in a mood to go even further. So his first venture beyond the limits of Gaul is actually across the line. There's a couple of German tribes that actually crossed the line and raided into Gaul. So Caesar immediately chases them down. He builds a bridge. It takes him 10 days. He stays in Germany for 18 days, killing as many Germans as he can, pacifying them in what was a very, very bloody conflict. He then retreats back, pulls down the bridge. And when you think about this, it's the most spectacular stunt because it illustrates firstly that there's nowhere that the Romans can't go. But more specifically, it illustrates the fact that there is nowhere that Caesar can't go. So he's building this massive reputation. And I think that's really what the invasion of Britain is. It's a coup. It's a spectacular gesture. But when you think about it, he must be thinking as he defeated the Germans, as he crosses the Rhine, when he thinks about Great Britain, he's not going to meet an opposing force at the same level of his organization. They're technologically advanced, they're sophisticated, and I think in the back of his mind, he knows that invading Great Britain, it's kind of a cost-free adventure, if you like. And when you read through Caesar's own journals, I think that's what he first thought. But I actually think it's a little bit more riskier. Because I think the element of risk is a key part of it to Caesar. Keep in mind, Britain is this magical place that no one has really set foot on. No one really knows what's there. And actually, the French scholar writing about Caesar in Gaul, Christian Godinho, explicitly compares Caesar's landing in Great Britain to the moon landing of 1969. He says of Caesar's expedition that, like the moon landings, it's an imagination-defying epic, an achievement at once technological and straight out of an adventure story. And so, just like the moon landing, the drama of it is dependent on risk, dependent on the sets, dependent on going into the unknown where things could go horribly wrong. But I also think it's a manageable risk. The anxieties that the Romans have aren't just about the human dimension. There's also the divine dimension. If you can compare the mission to Britain to the moon landings, you can also very obviously compare it to the achievements of the man whose statue in Cadiz inspired Caesar to feel depressed, Alexander, because Alexander is said to have pushed to the end of the world and to have reached the ocean, which the Greeks and the Romans believed surrounded the entire world. And Caesar, by crossing the ocean from Gaul, he's doing something very, very similar. For the greasy ocean is divine, and the Romans have inherited that. So there's always the question about, are you divine enough to trust yourself to its waters? So Caesar, by doing that, he's trusting that he will measure up in the divine sphere as well as the human sphere. This is not just the edge of the unknown world. It's perhaps to some degree the edge of the mortal world. It's kind of a liminal place, and who knows what's beyond that mist. And of course, the human dimension is also very, very alarming because it's a deeply held Roman conviction. And I think this tends to be true of most imperial powers, that the further you go from the center, so in the case of Rome, the Mediterranean world, the further you go out, the more barbarous and savage the peoples that you come up against will be. And the Romans have always had a particular dread of the Gauls, because the Gauls had actually conquered Rome back in 390 BC. Great armies of Germans had actually descended within living memory of Caesar's lifetime. The man who had married his aunt, a Roman warrior called Marius, had defeated this kind of terrifying onslaught of German tribesmen who were absolutely giants. They were said to eat raw flesh. Their women were said to be very much into genital mutilation. So the sense that the North is an incubator of savages is very, very strongly held by the Romans. And the further north you go, the presumption is the more terrifying they're going to be. So to go from Gaul to Britain, you're taking that extra level of risk. But that's not just about prejudice, about going further north. Caesar believes there's a kind of economic reason why the people who live on the island of Great Britain will be fiercer. Because doesn't he say in his commentaries that the further you get from the imperial center, the less likely you are to being exposed to the Roman goods that make you dissipated and lazy and effeminate? And the taint of luxury will definitely not have corrupted the people in Britain. And I think that's the paradox that will run throughout this story, which is that even as the Romans despise the Gauls, and even more the Britons for their savagery, at the same time, they kind of admire the savagery as being the expression of a kind of innocence that they haven't been corrupted by the fruits of civilization. And it's a constant nagging anxiety for the Romans that civilization and empire and greatness might be sapping them and making them more vulnerable to the eventual onslaught of these barbarians. So you have to hit first. And of course, this is all very familiar. I mean, we're talking about the British Empire where people absolutely thought that about the British Empire. You know, the romance of Africa or the Northwest frontier was actually built up with the idea that urban civilization corrupts you and makes you decadent. And the further away you get from home, the more authentic and the more manly and all that sort of stuff that you actually are. So there's a lot of that going on. But in turn, there's also an aspect of American imperialism in that one of the luxury goods that is being exported by Roman merchants is alcohol, and specifically wine. And just as there was a sense in that, you know, the expansion west in the US that you could use whiskey to kind of sap the moral character of the natives, the Romans are doing exactly the same because they've been introducing wine into Gaul for about a century before Caesar goes to Gaul. And the Gauls love their wine neat, and there's a lot of alcoholics, and people want more wine. But here's the thing. The only thing that they have to pay for wine is slaves, and the only way to get slaves is to fight with your neighbors. So it serves to foster kind of increased tribal conflict and tension. The Romans can then take the slaves that they're getting for the wine and bring them back to Rome, set them to work in the vineyards growing more wine, exporting it back. Unless you're a Gallic slave, it's a virtual circle. But the effect of all this for Caesar is that when he turns up in Gaul, they're drunk and they hate each other and they're fighting each other. And it's much, much easier for Caesar to conquer them on that basis. He also says people called the Belgae were occupying what is now Belgium. I mean, that's why it's called Belgium. He says that these are the people furthest from Rome and its wine merchants, and so therefore they are the strongest. And the same would obviously apply to Britain. But having said that, there is also a sense that Caesar knows that this isn't quite true because he knows that the merchants have penetrated into Britain. You know, earlier on I talked about the Venati, the Venetians, who control the channel. They actually exact tolls on people crossing the channel. So people are definitely crossing that channel, and you have to assume that they would be merchants and travelers. You would also have to assume that maybe there are chieftains in Gaul who have allies or maybe a direct overlordship in Britain. Because Caesar in his commentaries is making two contradictory claims. On the one hand, he's saying that nobody in Gaul knows anything about Britain. He repeatedly emphasizes this. On the other hand, he says that the Britons are helping the Gauls to fight the Romans, and that is justification for him to invade Britain. So both those can't be true. I mean, Caesar is trying to build up a sense of mystery because the commentaries are being written for his public back in Rome. And so he wants to make it seem as mysterious as possible. He knows that Britain, like Gaul, is divided into tribes. He knows that there are Gauls who know enough about Britain that they can advise him on what's going on. So I think that Caesar, when he's standing on the beach in Gaul, looking across at the white cliffs of Dover, he has a sense that the techniques and methods that he's employed in Gaul to subdue it will probably work in Britain as well. I think he also knows that he can also take interpreters or people who speak the same language or a similar language who will understand the British customs and their religions and all that kind of stuff. Caesar also writes about a guy called Claudius, who is a king of a people called the Atrebati, which is a Belgic tribe, and Caesar actually rates him very highly. He says that this man, Commius, who is the king of the Atrebati, is a man whose courage, judgment, and loyalty he holds in high opinion. Caesar, of course, is always speaking in the third person about himself, and Caesar sends Commius ahead of him to negotiate with the various British chieftains there and to try and persuade them to come to terms with the Romans before they arrive. Now, it also has to be said that initially this plan doesn't work out very well, because no sooner has Commius arrived in Britain and he's being imprisoned and loaded down with chains. But Caesar's not worried about this. He carries ahead with his plans. He's got 2 legions, the 7th and the 10th. So the 10th is the guy that I read to you at the beginning with the standard who jumps into the sea. So all in all, he's got about 10,000 legionnaires. He's also got cavalry. He's got supply ships bringing food and so on. So probably about 80 ships, most of it drawn from the fleet that he's used to defeat the Venetians. And in early September, not the greatest month, he crosses the Channel. And it's one of the descriptions that I always remember from childhood. And it was always being illustrated in books like, the Ladybird books. He's approaching the White Cliffs of Dover, and there are Britons with bristling moustaches, waving clubs and spears, and brightly painted blue in chariots racing along the cliffs. And Caesar obviously recognizes that this isn't a great place to land. So he bypasses Dover and he heads up towards a shingle beach where Walmer and Deal now stand. And this is almost 100% where he lands. And you would have to think it's very, very intimidating for his soldiers. I mentioned the standard bearer of the 10th and how he had to shame them into climbing out of their boats and wading ashore. And the Britons are terrifying because they seem to be conjured from all the very worst nightmares that the Romans have ever had. They have chariots, they're dyed blue, and they have this unmistakable facial affectation. Caesar says that they shave the whole of their bodies except the head and upper lip. So obviously that's a moustache that he's describing. They also shave their legs, and it's a concept horrible to the Romans, so much so that Latin doesn't actually have a word for moustache. Weirdly, they don't have archers, but they do have lots of slingers, very, very accurate slingers. And I suppose the rule of thumb is, if you have a moustache, you don't need archers. That must be the golden rule. And that's why the standard bearer of the 10th Legion has to do what he does, to jump into the sea, to invigorate everyone else. And I think for a legionnaire, seeing these hairy, painted, moustached Britons running along the beach in their chariots, it probably would have been very, very frightening indeed. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So the army of Rome are piling up the beach. 10,000 heavily armed men splashing through the surf. Once that standard bearer said, "Come on, follow me," they do manage to take the beach, and so the invasion of Britain begins. Straight after they landed, they build a fort. Because there's nothing the Romans enjoy more than building a fort. At any opportunity, they'll do it. And once they've done that, then they start to receive, over the following days, emissaries from the local chieftains. And they are being introduced by Commius, the Belgian guy that I spoke to you about who'd been sent over there earlier by Caesar. He's been freed and is acting as a kind of agent. And he tells them, the Romans, that the British are a little bit upset, and they reproach Caesar for making war on them without provocation. And it seems to be going quite well. Caesar doesn't take offense, but it's actually a bit of a damp squib. It really doesn't work out for Caesar at all. I mean, he disguises this as well as he can in his commentaries, but he's got all kinds of problems. So first of all, he can't land his horses' transports because they keep getting blown away. And so he's never able to land them. And without cavalry, he can't really act on any victory that gets won by his infantry. And of course, then you're going into mid to late September. And so as the days pass, the wind gets worse and worse. And there's one particular storm in which he loses most of his transport ships. And this is obviously really, really worrying because you don't want to be stranded on the island and not be able to get back. And of course, this terrifies his men, and I imagine probably terrifies Caesar himself. And this is the first recorded incident of bad weather in Britain affecting the course of history. This is the first recording. And it's also the worst weather he's ever known because most of his life has been spent in the Mediterranean, in Italy, in Spain, and of course Gaul. Obviously he's known storms before, but this must be the coldest place and the wettest place ever visited. And I think he finds it very, very unsettling. As are the chariots, which Caesar really, really obsesses about. Keep in mind, chariots are used in Rome only for races. The Gauls never used them, and they're seen as rather old-fashioned, but the Britons are very adept at using them, and it's the chieftains who deploy them, and they're very skilled at kind of running up and down the parts of it that connect to the horses, doing all kinds of tricks like that, and firing their slings, from being upside down, and shooting their spears and all that kind of thing. And so generally, I think you get a sense from Caesar that this is actually tougher than he anticipated, that the resistance is more intimidating, that the weather is more unhelpful, that the gods are not on his side. And if you have this kind of shadowy sense that you might be intruding into the dimension of the gods, then bad weather isn't just happenstance, it may be expressive of more ominous forces. And don't forget the Druids. And so even though Caesar does manage to win victory after victory, his men are out foraging, they get attacked. Caesar comes to the rescue and beats the enemy off. There's a sense, I think, that Caesar feels like there's nothing much to be gained by actually staying in Britain for a very long time. He's made his landing. He's made his point. The chieftains know how powerful he is. And he's in a position now where he can write back to Rome about invading Britain. This is all good for his persona, and so after about a fortnight, he actually takes the chance to go back to Gaul, and that's that. In a way, it's not such a big problem for Caesar, because when he lands, he knows that there's no central political authority in Britain, so there's no capital. I mean, he can't turn around and say, well, the capital is Birmingham, and I'll seize it and subdue these people. And as far as he's concerned, presumably, it's all kind of archaic chaos, and very many different tribes. And these are all sorts of things that cause him to step back, to have a breath, and think about what he's doing. And what he's thinking basically is that if he does conquer one tribe, there'll be another that will come forward. I think he also thinks that if he'd landed earlier in the year, if he had cavalry, if he'd come in greater force, if the weather had been better, maybe he would have been able to capitalize on all of that. And I think indisputably that's what he's thinking, because that's exactly what happens the following year. And of course, in that year, he's working out who the various tribes are in Britain, which ones are friendly, which ones are hostile, who might be amenable, who he's going to have to defeat, and he's putting more of a strategic plan together. And I think one of the reasons that he's spending so much time doing this is because he does want to conquer Britain. But his initial 2 weeks there, even though he thinks effectively it's a failure, back in Rome, this news is enormous. The Senate, who is full of people who really don't like him at all, they actually decree him a public thanksgiving that lasts for 20 days. And Caesar, who is all about making a big splash back in the capital, making himself the darling of the people, he realizes that going to Britain was huge and that going back will also be huge box office. And so I think that absolutely confirms him in his resolve that he will come back again in 54 BC. So some listeners to this podcast may be thinking imperialism, as it was driven by the search for markets and resource, is exactly why people do it. And of course, then the question that begs is, what's the economic reason for going to Britain? And I imagine they're thinking that the market of the Britons is crucial to the Roman economic success, and asking the question, is there a resource? And the classic thing that people always say is tin. The Romans came to Britain for tin. And I often wondered whether there was any truth in that, because there is tin down in Cornwall, and there is some tin in Kent, but there's also rumours that there's gold. And of course, we now know that there is Welsh gold, that there's silver, that there's lead. So the sense that Britain is full of mineral wealth is very, very strong in the Roman Republic. And so therefore, hopefully, that will be useful to Caesar. So there are reports that Britain is full of riches. But of course, even if there's nothing there, there is a source of income which Caesar has been making great use of in Gaul: slaves. So Caesar in Gaul has enslaved over 1 million people and become incredibly rich from it. And I'm sure that, just on this abortive trip, he's had a number of clashes, and he would have certainly have taken prisoners, and he'll be taking them back with him to sell. I think also that during that 2 weeks while in Britain, he was given an opportunity to look at the fractional infighting that was actually taking place within Britain and within the tribes. And there's this sense that actually all Caesar has to do is put out feelers to the various chieftains in Britain to see who will acquiesce. As the commander of a large army, he's of great interest to the British chieftains who are fighting their own wars. And even though Caesar's landing has been very brief, what people have seen of the Romans was menacing enough that some chieftains decided that they would actually use him. In particular, there's a guy called Mandibracus, who is a prince of a tribe called the Trinovantes. And the Trinovantes are based north of the Thames estuary in what's now Hertfordshire and Essex. And they're probably the most powerful tribe in Britain. But there's an up-and-coming tribe to the west called the Cativellani. And the Cativellani occupy basically the home counties, great areas that surround Greater London. And they're under a king called Castellovillanus. And he has overthrown Mandibracus' dad, the Trinovantian king. So Mandibracus has gone running to Caesar saying, please, will you help me? And of course, Caesar is absolutely all over it. So when he sails back to Britain in 54, he does it as the ally of a British prince. And I think you can tell that Caesar sees this as being a genuine opportunity for conquest on a Gallic scale, because he comes back with a very much larger force, and he has elephants. Can you imagine? So in 55 BC, the first invasion, he went with 2 legions, just over 10,000 men. In 54, he lands with 5 legions, so about 35 to 40,000 men with elephants. And he also has about 2,000 cavalry. I mean, this is a very, very intimidating force, far larger than any force that a British tribe would be able to oppose him with. He lands again on the beach at Deal, and the conventional thinking is also on the Isle of Thanet. And the Isle of Thanet nowadays is the northeastern-most tip of Kent. And this time, he's not opposed, because clearly the force he's bringing is so intimidating that no one wants to stand up to him. And so he marches out, he storms a hill front and conquers it, and he's heading westwards, when again there's a massive storm, and not all of his ships have yet been beached. And so he has to go back. He arranges for the ships to be pulled up. And anyone who's been to the beach at Deal will know that it's an absolute perfect spot to drag up a Roman transport ship. And then they build an even larger fortification. So they surround their ships completely so that the ships are absolutely secure from the storms and secure from any natives who might be mad enough to attack. And then he resumes his march westwards again. He goes across Kent, and he reaches the Thames. So now, not only does he have his legions, but he has the Trinovantes, and he has 5 other tribes who have joined him. He says all of whom have come to Caesar and have submitted to him. As he's doing that, of course, all the enemies of the Trinovantes, notably the Cativellani, are also drawing in allies. So to the Romans, we kind of see it as a clash between the Romans and the Cathavalorni, but to the Britons, it's a clash between the Trinovantes and the Cathavalorni. And the Romans are kind of, in many ways, incidental to the story. But of course, that's not how Caesar himself sees it. So Caesar crosses the Thames for the first time, and we think he builds a bridge, which is very much in the place where London Bridge now sits. And there are 12-foot stakes driven into the river, but he basically brushes them aside, and he then storms the stronghold of Castle Valenus. So the Romans call it Oppidum, which means a kind of fortified town. And they call it that probably to dignify it. More likely, it's just a sprawl of low buildings, and it doesn't have the feel of a town in an urban center. Anyway, that's what gets stormed. There's a huge massacre. There's lots of enslavement. And Cassivellaunus recognizes that he's been beaten. And so as he approaches our old friend Commius, the Atrebatum king, the Belgian bloke that I spoke to you about earlier on, he goes to see if he can actually negotiate a surrender. And Caesar actually agrees terms. So Mantabrachius is restored to the throne of the Trinovantes. Cassivanius agrees to leave him alone, otherwise Caesar's going to slap him on the wrist, and both kings hand over hostages to Caesar, and they agree to pay an annual tribute to Rome. So in late September, he heads back to Gaul, and he has lots and lots of prisoners. He has promises of tribute from Rome, he has hostages, and above all, he has an amazing story, because he can actually go back and really major on the fact that Britain is unbelievably dangerous and savage, and yet he's conquered it. He actually writes a very detailed ethnographic report about it. He writes, women are shared between groups of 10 or 12 men, especially between brothers and between fathers and sons. He says how in the interior of Britain, and of course he hasn't actually reached it, so he's relying on hearsay, he says that they drink milk, which is obviously a disgusting habit to Romans. They eat only meat. And he describes them as being nomadic, which of course they're not. But Romans expect really savage barbarians always to be nomadic. And so that's why Caesar is serving this up for them. This is actually the first description, effectively, of life in very early Britain. So what he's saying is that they're nomadic, they're meat-eating, milk-drinking savages, and they share women between 10 or 12 people, including their fathers and sons. And I then wondered if any elements of that at all were true. And I came to the conclusion that they do drink milk and they do clearly eat meat. The thing that is really striking and inaccurate is the nomadic stuff. But keep in mind, Caesar's not particularly interested in accuracy. He wants to give a good story. And again, back in Rome, everyone is completely thrilled by this. And we know this because we have letters by Cicero, the great orator and philosopher, who's actually an opponent of Caesar's. So he actually writes to a friend, and he says that the reports back from Britain is that it's more savage than rich, that basically there are lots of slaves. And then Cicero, who is actually withering about the quality of the slaves in Rome, because this is so important to him, he said, the slaves that he brings back have no aptitude for literature. They know nothing about music. And this is obviously a very kind of amused turn from him. But of course, it doesn't fool anyone. Cicero is as thrilled as everyone else. Caesar also, according to Pliny, brings back pearls. And Pliny says that he makes a kind of cuirass from British pearls, and he dedicates it to his ancestors, to Venus in the Great Temple, to Venus that Caesar builds in due course when he actually gets back to Rome. And the really weird thing about this is, when I read this, I was thinking, I actually know nothing about pearls, and I then wondered, is there just a finite stock of pearls? Did he take them all? I've never heard someone talking about how brilliant British pearls are. What I do know is that oysters are very big in Britain at this particular time. And British oysters, they're seen as being the best in the world. The Romans say so. Equal first with the oysters that you get from the Lucrane Lake in the Bay of Naples. But I also think in a way, all this discussion about pearls that Caesar talks about and oysters and stuff, it's not really the point, because the point is the story. It's the opportunity it gives Caesar to play act as Alexander. And I think that's why he makes all this stuff up. But having said that, I also think that all this stuff about treaties and hostages and so on, Caesar is clearly laying the grounds for another visit to Britain where he's planning to do what he did in Gaul. He can manufacture an excuse for intervention at any point, at any time that he wants. And this is exactly the course that he's been doing while in Gaul. This is what enabled him to conquer the whole vast expansive of what was Gaul. And I think what's really interesting is that he never actually goes back to Britain, because in the summer of 54, rumors are coming from Gaul that the harvest is failing. And over the course of 53, the impact of that angers the Gallic population even more. And I think it deepens into a festering sense of insurrection. And so in 52, there's a mass revolt in Gaul led by Vercingetorix. So anyone who has read Asterix, Vercingetorix is the guy who is shown throwing his armor down on Caesar's feet. It's a kind of parody of a famous picture of Vercingetorix surrendering to Caesar, which he does in due course. But it's a very, very close-run thing, I have to say. And Caesar's efforts are devoted entirely to just pacifying Gaul. And if truth be told, he doesn't have time to bother with Britain. And then, of course, in 49 BC, Caesar crosses the Rubicon. The Roman world is engulfed by civil war, and people actually just forget about Britain. There's no prospect of the Romans returning there because now what's at stake is the future of Rome itself. Once that gets settled, Britain is still, I think, too tangential. If you're Augustus or Mark Antony, all the actions in the Mediterranean, all the money and the power and the prestige, it's there. Who really cares about Britain? Whereas the converse, I think, is that for Britons, the impact of Caesar's invasions are actually quite considerable. First of all, because even the few weeks that Caesar had been in Britain in 55, the impact of Roman militarism had been highly destructive for any British chieftain that they had come into contact with. I think it was a wake-up call. It was a warning of just how potent these foreigners across the seas are. Equally, the second invasion of 54 really opens Britain's eyes up to just how rich Rome is, how wealthy it is, how impressive it is, how incredible its material goods are. And so again, that kind of serves to integrate Britain into a Roman world, even if there's not any kind of direct colonization. They've seen what they can't have, and therefore they want it, so therefore trade starts to happen. And what we see is an increase in trade from Gaul directly to Britain, Roman goods. And I think also the fact that Gaul is occupied by Rome, that Britain isn't, because there are so many links between Britain and often Gaul. The Roman occupation of Gaul inevitably has an impact on Britain as well. And you can see this through the afterlife of Commius, the guy who was sent to the British chieftains by Caesar, who plays a very complicated game, I have to say. And the complexity of the game that he plays, I think, is the best highlight that we have into this matrix of relations between the Gauls and the Britons and the Romans. So Commius actually goes back with Caesar in 54 to Gaul, and he assists the Romans against the Gallic rebels because he's an ally of Rome. But in 52, when it looks like the Romans are going to lose against Vercingetorix, he switches sides, and he's one of the leaders that leads an enormous force to try and rescue Vercingetorix in Alatia, the fortress where Caesar is besieging him. That expedition gets wiped out. Vercingetorix is forced to surrender. Commius retreats and goes into hiding. There are then 2 Roman attempts to try and assassinate him. But then when civil war breaks out, Commius negotiates a deal with Mark Antony, who is Caesar's lieutenant in Gaul. And he actually gives up hostages. But then he demands from Antony that he doesn't have to have dealings with the Romans in person because he's worried that if he does, that the Romans will try and kill him or capture him. And Mark Antony agrees it. So having done that while Caesar and Antony are fighting the civil war in the Mediterranean, Commius then moves back to Britain. He sets himself up there as a king in what's now called Hampshire. And again, he's ruling a people called the Atrebates. And it's very unclear with regards to what's going on there. So there's a tribe called the Atrebates in Belgium, and there's a tribe called the Atrebates in Britain. And Commius is actually ruling both of them. But there's no direct link to know whether they're actually kith and kin, if there's commerce between the two of them. And we don't know any of this because none of it's written down. But we do know Commius. There's also an assumption at the time as well that, and we've had historians over the years make arguments about this, for example, that the Anglo-Saxons is an identity. It's not just an ethnic people. And what they say is that it can actually be assumed. So if you're actually working for an Anglo-Saxon tribe, you can call yourself Anglo-Saxon because you're actually copying the warlord. And it was very common at that time for people to do that. And I think what's clear as well is that the Gaelic British link, there's also a Roman one, because Commius, even though we have no further references to him in any of the classical texts, after his dealing with Caesar, we do know about him. And this is the exciting thing, because there's a written record. And it's a written record that comes from Britain itself. And it's stamped on coins that he issues that have his name. And here's the really interesting thing, folks. With this, Britain ceases to be an entirely prehistoric culture. For the first time, we have writing on a coin. And this is the very first writing in Britain. Commius's coins are linked to Caesar because they're in Latin. So Commius actually learns Latin because that's how he communicates with Caesar when he's in Gaul, which has been conquered by Caesar. And Commius then takes that across to Britain and mints his own coins as a marker of prestige and status and kinship in Latin. And as we'll see in the next episode, they have a huge influence on the other tribes as well. And Britain, as I said, it ceases to be entirely prehistoric, and it's reflective of the way in which, I guess, societies on the margins of a great imperial power, they don't have to be ruled directly. They don't have to be ruled directly by it to come within its orbit, to come within its sphere of influence. So the fact that you're starting to get these coins with names on them in Britain is clearly a marker of Roman influence. But the question for the British tribes is that all it's going to be? Is it always going to be a hands-off relationship? Or are the Romans, once they've sorted out their civil wars, which are raging in the decades that follow, once the Romans sort that out, are they going to be back? Well, spoiler alert, they are going to be back in the form of the Emperor Claudius and a proper invading army in 43 AD. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks, and I'll look forward to talking to you in episode 2. Bye for now.